everyone, and welcome to tonight's episode of Beginner Breakdown. My name is Alex Moellering, and I'm excited to be talking with you about our topic tonight, which is endgames. We haven't done endgames in a little while, and it's always good to revisit because they come up quite frequently, and it's important to be precise. And we're going to specifically be talking about king safety, the opposite of king safety really is active kings. How do we use our king? Because, you know, in the opening and the middle game, it's really imperative that we keep the king quite safe, tucked away, hidden from our opponent's pieces. Often we want to castle quite early in order to, again, avoid any attacks or breaking open of the center. But in the end game is when that all changes. In order to properly win most endgames, your king has to become an active piece. And I see someone in the chat invested in Silman's endgame course. Highly recommend. Very, very good. We're going to be talking about actually some stuff from Silman that I stole from a different book. But to start, let's just take a look at this famous endgame that's actually really instructive. I've looked at it in previous lectures, but it holds value even still and is relevant in a lot of different ways. So this is the position. This was from a game in 1905 of Marshall and Chigorin, and it is black to move and find kind of the best plan. So if you want to suggest a move, that's fine, but it's more important to understand what the right plan is for black, because it's easy to get a little bit distracted in this position and go astray. So if you had black here, taking a look at everything going on in the position, it's equal material, slightly imbalanced in the placement, right? We have two pawns on this side against one, but white has a passed pawn on d4. And perhaps our rook is slightly more active. Maybe black's or white's king is, again, slightly more active. So the question is, how should we continue here to make progress? And as always, if you are watching from home live, feel free to put a comment here in the Twitch chat and we can discuss the ideas. So TWM in the chat, rook c3 jumps out, but keep looking. So yeah, good idea to keep looking. It is a forcing move, right? Rook c3 is check, and it does pick up this hanging pawn on a3. So theoretically, after white moves, we would pick up a pawn. So the question is that the best plan for black? Why or why not? So my thought here is actually, when I first looked at this, rook c3 was the move I wanted to play as well. But rook c3 is slightly problematic. Yeah, the passed pawn is a bit of a concern. Because if we play rook c3 check, let's say king moves forward, we take. Two problems. One, white's king is more activated. They could potentially even play king d5 and try and guide this pawn home. But also, our rook has abandoned this open file, and now maybe white has a way to invade with rook to c2. Is that worth this rook pawn? I mean, we have two nice pawns over here, but it's hard to say. It's certainly going to be more imbalanced and a bit scarier, kind of a double-edged position. The move that was found in the game by Chigorin was actually to play king e6, ignoring the fact that we can just win a pawn, which is kind of crazy at first, right? We're going to not win a pawn in the endgame. But when you see the idea, it all becomes really clear. Okay, so we're going to advance the king. And we would really like to just play king to d5 and try and take this pawn. So white plays the move rook b3, preventing us from getting away with this idea we already had. Now we can no longer win the pawn. But we're quite happy here to play king to d5. And now white is forced to defend this pawn, which he does with rook to d3. And it seems like, okay, well, we could have won a pawn, but we didn't. So what was the point of all of this? Well, now that our king is more active and our rook is, again, very active, and when I talk about a piece being active, I mean that it's controlling a lot of relevant squares. It has the option to move to important places. This rook, if it really needed to, it could jump in and invade on the second rank. It could drop back to defend if it really had to. It can come out to a4 perhaps. We've got a lot of options with this piece. Compare that to white's rook, which looks very nice and centralized, but actually is quite stuck. If it leaves this, this rank, the third rank, then we can always come back with our idea of rook c3 check, and again, try and pick up this pawn. And if it leaves this file, well, now we're just picking up this pawn on d4. So the rook is actually really cramped. It needs to stay where it is, and it's not an active piece at all. And because of that, likewise, this king, right? Our king is looking to press forward and keep charging through, and white's king is now stuck on the defense. And black found that in this position, because these pieces are not nearly as active or aggressive, and our pieces are taking the initiative, that we could actually start to stall our opponent out. So Chigorin here played f5. Marshall played pawn to h3, because there's not really anything else to do, right? If you push this pawn, we'll just take it. Again, you can't move this rook for one of these two reasons, and you can't push this pawn now with f5, or we'll take it here. So the only real move is to just play this pawn, but Chigorin is very happy to just play the waiting game. h5, and in the game, king e2 was played, but if white continues to try and stall, we have just enough waiting moves. We could even continue with a5 if we needed more, and white is just going to run out of moves. So eventually you are going to have to do something, give something up, and there's not really a good way to do that. King e2 was selected in the game in order to kind of minimize these casualties. Rook takes, and now white does not have to make a trade of rooks, which is very important. If you're in an endgame, you want to keep it as complex as possible. So trying to keep the advantage by having your rook able to create counterplay, perhaps, was what happened in the game. I believe Chigorin went on to still win, but this was the idea from Marshall's side. Had he instead moved the rook, this again does not really help anything. So say you drop the rook back. As we said, this is going to allow rook to c3. And even though you can play rook to d3 and block and defend, well, now that we're trading the rooks off the board, this simplified endgame should be quite simple for black to win. We're just going to advance our pawns. We have a 2v1 majority here on the queen side, and there's not really anything white can do. Let's say king c3. We can even sacrifice this extra pawn in order to win this pawn here in the center. And we're just going to maneuver our king, eat up white's extra pawns, and very easily promote and win the game. So this is a simple example, but it illustrates a very important point, that the king needs to be an active piece in the endgame, even sometimes at the cost of material, right? If you play rook c3 here, you pick up a pawn, but is that really worth it when our opponent gets so much active counterplay? Probably not. Now that we have the idea of how important the active king is, there's two maneuvers and types of kind of positional ideas with endgames and with a king that are both incredibly important to understand. They're opposition and kind of the outflanking maneuver. So we're going to start with opposition. For a lot of these examples, I'm going to have a pawn somewhere on the board. Unless I say it's important, just ignore it, because otherwise I can't move the kings. It will treat it like it's a stalemate or something. So ignore this pawn. The idea here we want to look at is opposition with the kings. And this is just the most basic form. It's just called direct opposition. Both kings would like to advance forward, right? Black would like to move towards our side of the board. We would like to move towards their side of the board and try and gain ground, make progress in the position. But we have moved into this position where there is one square directly between us. We are facing each other. And because of that, this is called opposition. Each king is controlling these three squares. And when you are in opposition, the person who has to move out of the way is the one who's in a worse shape because they have to concede some ground. So for instance, in this position, if it is black to move, then they're going to have to step to one of these two sides, say king to e6, allowing us to make forward progress. King to c6 would do the opposite. And if it was our turn to move, we would obviously have to move out of the way, and they would do the same. So this is direct opposition. You can also have opposition that is indirect. This is sometimes called diagonal opposition as well. And it's the same type of idea. It's just now the kings have a straight line in between them, facing each other with one square, where it's just a diagonal instead of a vertical or horizontal line that they are facing on. And usually this is going to transpose, right? So say again it's black to move. They are the ones who, if we have the opposition and they have to move, then we are going to make progress. If they move down, we can make progress this way. If they go to the side, we can make progress this way, right? Creating a direct opposition that is, again, going to let us break through. Quick aside, we have a question from the chat at the end of our session. London and Carl Khan, which endgames come up most so I know where to focus my endgame study? It's a good question. Let me come back to that at the end and see if I can give you some kind of answer. But I want to continue with the definitions right now. Okay, so we have direct and indirect opposition. And now we want to talk about something that's probably the next level up, and even maybe potentially more important. When the two kings are very far apart, it seems hard to know who is going to have opposition if they are to approach each other. Because remember, whichever side has opposition is the one that can make progress. And if you don't have opposition, you're going to be forced out of the way. So we can use the idea of distant opposition to determine who is going to have that in this position. The rule we like to follow to figure out who is going to have opposition is this. Whoever is the person who moves with an odd number of squares between the kings does not have opposition. Or alternatively, whoever moves when there is an even number of squares between the kings does have opposition. So let's take a look at what I mean. In this position, it's white to move. And how many squares are there between these two kings? Well, there's 8 ranks on the board, and we are occupying 2 of them. So mathematically, there's 6, which is an even number. And we're the one moving. So if there's an even number, that means we have the opposition. Now it's black's turn to move, and there's an odd number of squares. We've just taken 1 away, so there are only 5 in between us, which means that we have the opposition still, because again, they have an odd number and they have to move. And we'll see if both sides walk towards each other. This is how it works out. We make it to d4 and have direct opposition where black has to move out of the way. And we can make progress in the position. This is going to be the same if it's on a diagonal. So we'll count the number of squares in between, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And because it's, let's say in this case, it's white to move, with an even number, when we make the move, it is still going to be us with opposition when the two kings meet in the center. Okay, this is again an indirect opposition or a diagonal opposition that could transpose to a direct quite naturally. So this seems pretty simple, right? It's not too hard to understand how the kings are, which one is going to have opposition when they interact, when they're in a straight line, right? When it's in either a file or a diagonal. This becomes a little trickier when they fail to connect in such a simplistic way. So let's take a look at this example. Again, ignore our pawn here on h2. In this type of situation, we want to figure out with white to move whether or not we're going to be able to take the opposition or maintain the opposition, and what that looks like. And generally, the rule of thumb is when you're in this type of situation, in order to gain opposition or maintain opposition, you want to step onto a square of the same color as your opponent's king. So take a look at this. If we go king to a2, notice how both the white and black king are on a light square, and we could kind of imagine a box connecting the two. What this tells us is if we're able to take a square of that color, that we will have the opposition here when we make that move. So let's say black continues king to f8. The move we need to play here is king to b2, continuing that square. If they come back, then we do the same thing, right? We want to stay on that same kind of color complex, and eventually this works its way out. No matter where they go, we're going to keep following in this kind of color pattern and see how eventually we end up here with our indirect opposition, which again can very easily transpose to direct opposition. And there's lots of deviations that can happen here, but for example, if king to e7 in this beginning, then instead of going to somewhere else, we would just go to b2, right? and it's the same type of deal. Or if in this position, instead of playing king back to e8, let's say black goes king to f7, here we can go king to b3. And we have this same light squared color complex that we are following them on. Eventually, we will make indirect opposition or direct opposition when we get close enough. Okay, one more concept. So this is really the basics of opposition. Now we're going to talk about outflanking, and then we're going to explain why is this all relevant. This seems so unimportant, but we're going to get there. Outflanking is a really simple but very useful technique. We've already seen it a little bit, but I haven't really explained it. But it's basically a way to make progress and reach critical squares in a position where otherwise you couldn't. In order to do this, we're often going to have to give up opposition, but we can still move our way into the key squares. Opposition is important, but it's only going to be a means to an end, and we're going to see that as we go. So in this example, this is actually kind of a really interesting puzzle. It is white to move, and our goal, again, let's ignore this pawn, pretend the pawn on h2 is not there. Our goal is to reach one of these two squares, f8 or h8. It doesn't matter which one. Black's goal is to stop us from doing so. If we can make our king touch one of those squares, we win this puzzle. And if black can stop us, then they will succeed in winning the puzzle. The question is, can we do it and how? And the first thing to note is we're probably going to need opposition. And here's what I mean. If we just walk towards this square by the direct approach, our opponent can take opposition. And as long as they have opposition in this way, we can never actually move forward. Right? Wherever we go, if we step back, they can follow us. And wherever we go, we're always the one conceding space. They're just going to mirror whatever move we play until we're stuck on the back rank and just moving around, and they're going to move and just copy us and cut us off. So if we give our opponent opposition too early, they can just cut us off from this whole half of the board. So what can we do instead? How do we take the opposition in this position? Keep in mind kind of the rules we looked at for opposition and see what you can come up with here. What should we do? And again, if you're in the chat or in person and have suggestions, feel free to throw them out there. So Susie in the chat suggesting king a2. Right, like we just saw, if we count the number of squares in between two kings in a straight line, we have 6. If it's even, then we can move forward in that direction and maintain opposition. So king to a2. Okay. Now black to move, and they're going to play very tricky. If they just like move forward, then we already know what's going to happen. Whether they move forward this way or this way, then we already know. We're just going to move forward, and we're going to take opposition and force them out of the way. So that's not going to be helpful for them. So instead, black plays the really tricky move, king to b8. Now, why is this so tricky? Well, again, black is laying a trap here and hoping we give up our oppositional advantage. So what can we do here? Okay, some suggesting going to b1. What do we think about that? King to b1, is that the move we need to play? Again, our objective here is to reach one of these two squares. Some suggesting b2, some saying a3. Yeah, so let's talk about some of these ideas. So king b1 is actually not going to work. And it's for the same reason as before. Now it's black's turn to move, but they have gained distant opposition. They're moving when we're in a straight line, and there's an even number of spaces between us. So they can just step forward. And we're going to be in serious trouble here. If we try and move forward, now they're the ones who can just go. And again, now they can stall us out. So we cannot go to b1. If we go to b3, let's say, then again, how many squares are between us? Now there are 1, 2, 3, 4 squares in between us. And black's the one moving, so an even number when they move means that they're going to have opposition. If we go to A3, and now A3 is a really interesting move. It's sort of trying to outflank, but we'll get to that more in a second. It's just a little too early for this. They can just play something like king to A7, and again, create this opposition, right? We have to move, and there's an odd number of squares, which means we're going to be losing opposition. So instead, the only way to make progress here is to play king to B2. We want there to still be this odd number when it's their turn to move of squares between us and them. So we keep the opposition, but also notice that our goal here is to reach F8 or H8. So we need to make progress in 2 directions, this way and this way. And right now we're making progress this way. We're going to do that first. Again, if black here tries anything funny, if they just try and move forwards, we already know we have the opposition. So we're just now making progress in both directions, this way and this way. So the best move for black is to actually play king to C8. And we're going to keep doing this dance, right? The same thing is going to be true every time. If we move forward, we're going to give them opposition. So we need to keep sliding this way, slowly making progress, even though it doesn't feel like it, because we need to get to this side of the board where we can come and attack these 2 squares. Okay, so we're going to continue this song and dance all the way down the board until we get to this really critical square G2. Again, ignore this pawn, because now black has a choice. They can go to H8, continuing in the line, or they can go to F8. But either square, they're conceding something. For example, if they go to F8, we can now outflank. We will give them opposition, but that's not going to matter very soon. We will go king to H3, and our goal is now here. They can take opposition this way and keep our king from this whole side of the board, but if we have identified a key square that we need to get to, they're going to have a really hard time stopping us. And the same is true if they go to H8. Where would we go now to start outflanking them? In this case, we would go to F3. And here's why. If they try and hold on to this opposition, right? They're going to do the same thing we did. They step into this light square to make this kind of box between the 2 kings, and they do get opposition. We're going to move forward, and they can take indirect opposition, and now direct opposition. But notice what they're keeping us out from. They're keeping us from getting over to this row. They are not keeping us from getting here. And now they actually can't stop us. Even though they have opposition, we still make it to our key square. So the idea of outflanking is we're sometimes willing to give up opposition in order to get our king where it needs to go. This will become really relevant later when we talk about pawn promotion. Okay, so instead, if they play just something like king to G7, right, we already know if they play king H7 and just go this way, we're just going to march our way down. So they need to try and stop us. So king to G7 seems to make sense. But now, what should we do? How should we continue to make progress? Any suggestions for us? Again, we want to touch one of these 2 squares. If we touch one of those squares, we win the game. Yes, Susie again in the chat, precisely, king to G3. Putting an odd number of squares between our king and their king in a straight line when it is their turn to move. Because now if they move towards us, we just take opposition, and we're going to force them away. We can start to advance our way in. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This is why they can't play king to G8, because if they play king to G8, where do we go to keep an odd number of squares between our king and their king? We go right forward to G4. So we're making progress slightly faster. So king to G7, and we play king to G3. Critical here that we don't move forward too quickly again, right? If we play king to G4 right now, they're just going to take opposition, And now, with opposition, they do bar us from this side of the board. So instead, king to g3. And again, black has a bunch of moves they can play here, but probably the trickiest is king to f7. Trying to, again, bait us into making a mistake. If we step forward anywhere, they're going to take opposition, except on h4. Because now it's the same thing we just looked at. We're giving up opposition. If you play king to f6, you're getting opposition, but you cannot keep us from this square. You either have to give it back up, in which case we still hold on to opposition, or you keep it and you can't stop us. So instead, king to g6. But now it's already too late. We just take direct opposition on g4, and the king slowly has to work its way back. We will continue to outflank our opponent, giving them opposition, but they're not able to stop us from getting to this key square. So they instead go back, we take opposition again, and this dance continues until eventually they have to pick. Are they going to stop us from coming to h7 and h8, or are they going to stop us from coming to f7 and f8? And they cannot stop both. So we will force our way to touch one of those squares. Now this puzzle is, again, not something that would be immediately obvious how it's relevant to a game of chess, where we're just running the kings around and trying to touch different squares on the board. But it actually becomes very, very apparent where this is valuable when we think about pawn promotion. So I've talked about promoting pawns at different points in this beginner breakdown series, but it's always something so important and so critical and so fundamental to winning chess games that it's worth a revisit. And now we have some new language to talk about it. We have the language of opposition and outflanking. If you want more details on pawn promotion just as an entity itself, then please check out some of the other videos on that. But the basic idea is we're going to need our king in front of our pawn because we need to get to a key square. When you're trying to promote a pawn, and let's assume it's not a rook pawn because those your opponent can always kind of guard. If it's any of these, a pawn in any of these more central files, then we need our king in front of it because we need our king to get to the square that's basically a knight's move in front of the pawn on these two squares. Now, why do those matter? Well, if you can, actually, it can also be this one right in front. If you can get your king to any of these three squares, then there is nothing black can do to stop us from promoting the pawn. And let me show you what I mean. So let's just step the king forward. King e3, king e6, and king e4. So notice here how I've taken opposition. In this case, black has to give it up. They have to move out of the way. But remember, opposition is only a means to an end. I'm going to continue pressing forward, outflanking my opponent, allowing them to take opposition if they want, because the goal isn't now to, stop me from getting to a side of the board. Their goal is to stop me from being able to escort this pawn to promotion. So they can't afford to play a move like this. I'm just going to push the pawn forward, and I'm just going to keep marching up. So instead, they have to step back. And you'll notice this is a very similar pattern to what we were looking at before. We'll take opposition. They have to pick a side. Whichever way they go, we can just step forward. If they go this way, we'll step this way. Now, what is critical, though, is you might be wondering, okay, well, that just seems like all you need to do is be in front of the pawn. So why did I say it has to be these squares? There's like a little bit of breathing room right here, kind of a gap. Well, the reason for that is because if we're not careful, if we don't leave a gap, say in this position, I play the move pawn to e3, now black takes opposition. And wait a minute, the three squares I needed to get to, right, with one square in front of the pawn, now black will always be able to stop me from getting there. They fully control all of those squares. And without opposition, I can't win this endgame. If my king is not able to stay in front. And here's what I mean. So they can kind of just wall us off. Eventually, I'm either going to need to move my king backwards or move my pawn forwards to try and make progress. And I can get my pawn all the way to the end of the board. The problem is, at the very end, there's a very critical moment. In this position where it's black to move, black now has 3 legal moves. Our king controls all of these squares, our pawn controls these two. So the king can only go to d8, f8, or e8. And 2 of those moves lose, 1 of them draws. If you go to d8 or f8, you give us opposition, which is going to allow us to force your king out of the way, and we can promote. So instead, the only drawing move here for black is to play king back to e8, predicting that wherever I go, you will be able to then take opposition and stop me. For example, king to f6, king to f8, taking opposition. I cannot make forward progress with my king, so I push the pawn, and you step in front of it, and now I am in a zugzwang. I have no moves that help me. The best move would be to pass, because if I move my king to any square away from my pawn, you will just take it, and it's a draw. If instead I move my king to e6 to defend my pawn, the only square I can move that defends the pawn, it's a stalemate, because I control all of these squares, and black has no legal moves but is not in check. So that is why I need to keep both opposition, but also that's why you want this one space of breathing room. Because if I have this space of breathing room, let's change it a little bit. If black ever gets opposition, it's not the end of the world, because as long as I have at least one spare square in between, I can always push the pawn and basically regain opposition, right? There is now an odd number of squares, and it's their turn to move, so they have to get out of the way, and I can press forward. I don't know how to pronounce your name, Lapsus Cosinus, but welcome. We're glad to have you here. Okay, so we talked about how to stop the pawn, but how do we actually finish our job here? So we're going to move the king forward, take opposition, and outflank, meaning we can give them opposition if they want it, but they're not going to be able to guard the key squares where we're going to promote. So instead, black steps back to stop us, we step over, and we continue moving all the way down to the edge of the board. And once you reach your king to the 6th rank, you don't have to worry about opposition anymore. We can just start pushing the pawn, because this position is a win for white, regardless of whose move it is. Again, if you want more details on that, please check out the video on kind of, I think it's just called like something about endgames, beginning of the endgame or something like that. But here, if it's black to move, then they have to move out of the way, and we will step forward and promote the pawn. Again, outflanking. If it is white to move here, so let's lose a move real quick. So it's white to move now. It doesn't really matter because the timing still works out where I can just push the pawn and still get this relevant square. Okay. It is not possible to castle vertically, only on the horizontals. Okay, so this is the basics of kind of how to promote a pawn, and we were able to piece it together with understanding how do we get our king to the key squares, right? We always want to be with one square in between, and to do that, we need to maintain both opposition and outflanking whenever it is appropriate. So let's take a look at this one, because we talked about how to win these games, but it's also how can we stop ourselves from losing. In this position, it's white to move. Black has their king and pawn dangerously close to the promotion ranks. If they can get their king to one of these key squares, then we can't stop them from winning the game. The question is, do we have any way to do that? And we actually can if we think about our ideas with opposition. So white to move, how can we stop black from winning this game? Anyone have any ideas? If you had white here, what would you play? Because we need to stop this pawn from promoting. Webster in the chat has the right move, king to c1. And let's think about this. if we move our king away, it's quite obvious that we cannot stop black from getting to one of the key squares. They can just quickly walk this way, and their king is in front of the pawn. There's nothing we can do. If we step forward, then black can actually just take opposition. And if we give them opposition, then eventually they can force us to give it up. They can outflank and again push the pawn forward. So that's not going to work. And the same thing here. If we step to c2, it's the same thing. They will just take opposition. And there's nothing we can do to stop them. So the only move that is going to hold a draw is king to c1. And this is actually really critical. Why does this hold a draw? It's because of distant opposition. We have 3 squares in between the kings right now. They're facing each other with 3 squares in between. That's an odd number. It's our opponent's turn to move when it's an odd number of squares. That means we have the opposition. The problem for black is this. If they try and step forward in any direction, wherever they go, we are ready to meet them with opposition. If they go this way, we can hold it this way, but you can also just move towards the pawn with indirect opposition. If they step forward to c4, again, we will just step to c2, opposition. You cannot make progress here. You cannot keep the king in front of the pawn. And if instead you go king to d4, it's the exact same thing. We just take opposition. If you have to push the pawn, well, then we can go kind of wherever we want, as long as we can keep your king from stepping to the key squares. So in a game like this, it could be very easy to lose it, right? In the very end, you've played a very strong game, and you just play the simple move king to c2, and it's all over. So the hope that I have here is that we can help you avoid some of those issues. Let's look at one that's maybe a little more confusing. It's white's turn to move. And all I did was I shifted the king from b1 to c1. Can we still hold a draw? Or does this simple placement issue mean that we are going to lose? If you had white, so yeah, I have 2 questions. Do you think white can hold this? And if so, what would the move be? Remember our rules of opposition and how we want to think about it. This is a tricky one. So someone says white can't hold. It certainly seems that way. Someone's suggesting king to d1. Okay. So let's think about this. From b1 to c1, we have all the same problems that we had before. If we had stepped forward in that example, then we will be met with opposition. If we step forward in this example to any of these squares, our opponent has distant opposition, right? There's an odd number of squares between the 2 kings. And if we move forward, then we're the one moving with the odd number. They have opposition. King b2 does not work because, again, first they're going to take opposition if they want it. But they can also take indirect opposition and just come this way to help the pawn get home. So we can't move forward at all. They just have us covered. However, if we go to d1, fascinatingly, this is a draw for a very specific reason. Black would love to play the move king to d5 and maintain this oppositional advantage. But there's a pawn there, so you can't do it. And any other move, we can start to cut you off from the key squares. If we can keep you from getting to any of these 3 squares, we can win this game. If this king steps forward, it's very easy. And if the king steps forward here, it's the same thing. We don't go forward to d2, giving them opposition. We go king to c2, maintaining the opposition. And again, there's no way for black to make progress. We will copy them wherever they go and get our king in front of the pawn. So this is actually the only way to win this one. It's kind of, or not win, but to hold a draw. which when you're down a pawn and there's nothing else on the board, you should be pretty happy with that result. Okay, let's do another exercise. One of my friends here at the chess club, National Master Caleb Denby, if you have seen any of his lectures, did a really fun puzzle where in this example, it's white to move. And here's the problem with this specific puzzle. Now, if you know the king and rook endgame, it's pretty easy to win. But here's the trick. It's white to move and win, but you can only move the rook one time, which means you're going to need to move the rook to get checkmate. So unless you are moving the rook with checkmate, the rook is not allowed to move. Can we do it? Can we force black into a checkmate even if we only get to move the rook once? What should we do? What should our idea be? This is the first thing you ever learned? That's awesome. I never saw this until just recently. So I think it's really cool. But it totally plays into our oppositional idea. Yeah, Richard, we're going to shoulder the king basically all the way back. So the first thing we need to do is take opposition, right? This is kind of the central thing here. And what's critical is because our rook is attacking everything in this line, this king can never step in that direction. You can't move into check. So we never have to worry about that. We can effectively treat this whole line as an edge of the board that is off limits to black's king. So when we take opposition, black is limited to 3 moves. You can move to h3, h4, or g4. If king goes to g4, how do we maintain opposition? We just follow him forward. And we can do this all the way to the end of the board until it's a checkmate. Okay, what else can you try? If you go to h4, then we can also do the same thing. We can maintain opposition. If you go backwards, we're just going to follow you. If you go again backwards diagonally, we're just going to follow you. And we can force a checkmate this way. As long as we have maintained opposition, we can force checkmate with only moving the rook one time. So the tricky one here is after king to g1, what if I play king to h3? Because now, if you maintain opposition, which is fine, you can do that, I'm just going to go back and we're going to start repeating moves. You're not going to make any progress. So how do you make progress here? Yes, precisely. I don't know how to pronounce your name in the chat, but king to f2. This is our outflanking maneuver, right? It's the same thing. When we have opposition, the benefit is we can either stop someone from making progress towards us, or we can outflank to reach a critical square. In this case, the problem is now black has a tough choice. If they go, well, let's look at their options now. Their options are still 3 moves. Now they can go to h2, h4, or g4. If they go to g4, then we're just going to repeat what we just did, where we're going to retake opposition. And they have these same 3 moves as before, where we're either going to follow them back, follow them diagonally back, or if they go to h4, we're just going to repeat what we just did, outflank. If instead they play king to h2, then now they're in a zugzwang of a different kind, because now we step to f3. And when they play up the only move, well, now they have taken opposition successfully, but that actually means that our king is cutting them off, and this is a checkmate. And this is going to be true at every instance of it in the game. So say they play g4, and then they go h3, it's the same thing. You can't go down this way, because it's a checkmate. If you go to h5, taking indirect opposition, what should we do here? We have to be very careful. So I have a few things. So someone's saying F4, someone's saying G3, someone's saying G2. So we seem really divided on this one. Think about it kind of oppositionally. If we play king to G2, can black take opposition? Yes. Which means if they get the opposition, there's no way to complete this puzzle. We're going to have to use the rook for more than that, because they can just stall us out forever. If we play king to G3, it's the same thing. So instead of allowing them to take opposition in that way, the only way we're comfortable with them taking opposition is here, where we can eventually get a checkmate. So we just continue. We'll move to king to F4. And notice how this actually just repeats with the position before. We go to F3 and we have this kind of awkward outflanking maneuver where they're trying to take opposition but shouldn't. If they step back, we just repeat it and give them the same choices. They can either step forward and get checkmated, or they can step backwards and allow us to, if they step here, we take opposition. And if they step here, we just continue to repeat all the way to the end of the board. So a very simple puzzle, right? Just 3 pieces and 1 arbitrary rule. We can't move the rook until it's checkmate. And even then, we can still force the king to move exactly how we want because of our use of these 2 techniques, opposition and outflanking. When you put them together, it's an incredibly deadly and incredibly powerful force. I want to show you 3 more examples that kind of all highlight this idea. Someone was asking for some more distant opposition examples, and I hope this will partially suffice. So this is our position, and I believe it's white to move, and we're playing from the black side here. Do we have any hope in this position of winning or at least drawing? What do we think? Is this a win for white, a win for black, or a draw? The hint I will give you is not really a hint, it's just telling you it's absolutely not us to win, because we have no way to move our pawns forward safely. They're just going to get captured. And white's king is closer. White's king has effectively become more active and is going to box us out and gobble up these pawns, and there's actually nothing we can do about it. So we cannot win. We're going to lose both of our pawns. Whether we push them or whether we don't, this king and pawns are going to be able to eat all of our pawns. So we can't win. The question is, can we draw or not? And actually, even though some people might look at this position and say it feels like we can just resign here because we can't stop these 2 pawns, there is a way to hold a draw as black if we keep our ideas in mind. So let's start by just walking towards those squares. But eventually, I mean, you can even play king e8 here. But eventually, we have a really tricky move. Again, the theme here is not so much the pawns, it is the kings. But actually, we can play h5 and force white into a really awkward spot of making a rook pawn. Because if they choose to make a rook pawn, they actually have 2 rook pawns, and if we can get our king snuggled up into the corner, they actually cannot stop us from, they cannot do anything to force us out of it. So king to e8, and if they just keep running the pawn forward, we'll catch it this way. If they move the king, then again, we can hide our king on the corner. And even though they have 2 pawns, because they are both rook pawns, we can just bounce our king back and forth between these 3 squares for the rest of the game, and there's actually no way to outflank, right? Because outflanking, or even taking opposition, doesn't really matter anymore because you cannot outflank in this direction, right? The board ends. So that's why the corner pawns are different. Okay, but let's look if we do something else. So they don't have to take, they don't want to take the rook pawn. So instead, let's say they defend their pawn. Yeah, what if, so good question from Insane Lonely Bear. I love that username. So if they just play h3 and defend, right? How do we do anything here? Well, now we can trade pawns and take opposition. Remember, even though we can't save our pawn, If white can manage to get to one of these 3 squares after our pawn is gone, they'll win. If we can keep them from getting to any of those key squares, we can hold a draw. And here white's in zugzwang. If they take our pawn, we take opposition. Even though they have the extra pawn, they cannot get to the square they need to, and the game is a draw. If they don't take our pawn, we can just wait them out. We'll either repeat moves, or eventually they will give up and take the pawn, and it's a draw. So even in some crazy positions like this, if you can remember the ideas of opposition, in this case, you have to have a little knowledge of rook pawns and maybe the rule of the square. But if you can keep those in mind, we can still hold draws in these positions just by using our king in a very strategic way with opposition. All right, here's our next example. In this position, it's white to move, and we're going to be playing from the white side. Our pawns are moving this way, these pawns are moving this way, so they're all locked up. And it seems like this should be a draw. It's totally even. The kings are equidistant, basically, from the pawns. So it seems like this should be a draw. But white actually has a way to win. First thing we need to do is we can't actually break through with any of these pawns. We have to recognize that if we try and push a pawn, then they can just take it, and we're not going to be able to catch up in time. So we cannot ever push those pawns, at least until the kings are close enough. So both sides are going to kind of scoot the kings to get a little bit closer. And now we enter this position. And the question is, how can white manage to win this? It seems like this should be over. But there actually is a way to force a win and not let the game just end up in a draw. What should we do in this position? And keep the ideas of opposition in mind. Outflanking as well, but I think this one is a little bit more about opposition. And if you have ideas, you're free to ask, and we can kind of talk about them. Any ideas? Okay, someone suggesting g5. I think you mean king to g5. Definitely an idea there. Take on g6, another idea. Lots of competition. Well, let's think about this in terms of opposition. Oh, someone, yes. Okay, so 17 and a few other people, actually, multiple people, have found the right idea. The first thing we want to do is take on g6. If we play king to g5, we actually end up in a really bad spot. And we'll see why in just a moment. If we take on g6, after they take, now what do we do? Now, if we take either pawn, they will take the other one, and this should be a draw. They can attack our pawn, but we can attack theirs, and we're both going to be able to promote. And the same is true if he takes the other way. So instead, king to g5, taking opposition, and whichever way I go, you will follow me with opposition, but also take my pawn. And now, you just have a passed pawn. If I go attack this one, you can still defend it. And there's nothing I can do to stop this pawn from promotion. If I had instead played king to g5 myself, then now black gets that exact same thing. They can take with opposition, and after we take, they follow us with opposition, and they will take either one. So even in these really kind of coordinated or balanced positions that look like they're going to be draws, if we can remember opposition and just how critical it can be to be able to be the one to force your opponent to concede space, it can make all the difference. Let's look at one final example. This one is, honestly, I don't think a beginner level puzzle. It's not exactly advanced, but it's going to combine all the ideas of opposition and outflanking together, and I think it's still going to be very instructive for us to look at. So in this position, it's white to move. Black has a rook pawn here on a5, and their king is far away on f8, but they are very skilled. Our opponent here with the black pieces is very skilled in the ideas of opposition. And if we don't play carefully, they will force their king in front of our pawn and deny us getting to one of these key squares. First of all, if they can just get their king close enough and keep a pawn on the board, it's just going to be an easy draw, because neither of us can push the pawn forward, and even if we do, then whoever loses it is still not going to be able to get their king in front of the pawn. So we have to be very careful here with how we play. The first move is a little more natural. We want to start this with king to c2. If we play too slowly, like king to b1, then black can just very easily move their king forward and actually just defend their pawn. Right now, even if we can trade the pawns and it's going to be dead equal, but even if they just give up the pawn for some reason, this still is not a win. I suppose if we take it this way, that would be. So again, they got to be careful with giving us too much opposition, but if they know what they're doing, if they go probably here, no, even then, well, yeah, they can take. So anyway, they don't even have to play precisely, but if they get their king super close to our pawn, then it's, yeah, basically over. So instead, yes. Insane Lonely Bear, yes, you spotted it slightly before I did. So king c2 instead. And now black plays a really tricky move. Instead of moving their king forward, they're going to play pawn to a4. If they bring their king forward, then the problem is we're just too fast. We get this pawn, and we can still get to one of these key squares very easily. Our king is far ahead of the pawn, but not too far where we can't defend it. So we're going to be able to easily win this endgame. So instead they play a4, cutting us off. We now cannot move to b3, which is a bit of a problem. This is the really critical position of this example, and it's kind of the last puzzle I will leave you with, maybe one more move. But it is white to move, and there's only one way to do this. This is very, very tough. Does anyone have any idea for how we can make progress as white? Okay, king d2 suggested. King b2, well, our pawn is on b2. King d3, king b1. Yes, a lot of people have the right idea, but 17 said the precise reason: we need to play king to b1. That's the only move, because otherwise black plays a3. If we play something like king to c3, a3 kind of destroys us. If we don't move the pawn, they will take it. If we take their pawn, then we now have a rook pawn, and again, they're just going to get their king in front of our rook pawn, and we can't win. So we have to play b3, but now they can slowly move forward. If we move our king this way to attack their pawn, they're just going to sneak through and promote. But as long as their pawn doesn't move, they're guarding this square. So something like king to e7, and say we play pawn to b4, they'll just force us back to stop their pawn, and their king is close enough to keep us from getting ahead. If instead of b4, we play something like king to c2, then again, their king is just going to be able to stop us, and even if we can stop their pawn, they're still at the very least going to be ahead of us. So instead, we have to play king to b1, where now if they play a3, we can scoot past with b3, and we're one move closer. King to e7, king to a2, and we effectively reach the key square of a5. A very hard example. If they go this way, we take opposition, and then again, they will have to concede one of these two squares. Really kind of crazy example, not something I would expect to come up in one of your games too often, but hopefully these ideas have been helpful for you in just understanding the basics of how the king should work in the endgame, especially against your opponent's king. These two ideas, outflanking and opposition, really, you can dig into these for a very long time, and they will continue to give you lots of help in your chess. that is all the time we have for tonight, but I hope you have enjoyed this lesson, and I hope you stick around because I believe we have our Grandmaster's Choice class with our new Grandmaster, who I forget who it is.
Josh Shang.
Josh Shang. Super excited. We're super glad to have him, so please stick around for that. I hope to see you soon.